to our code of conduct. So we use the R consortium's our community code of conduct. So that's here. So this is our goal is for this to be a friendly and professional space, and Andrew and I will be moderating. So we are really glad you're here, and we are happy for us to treat each other with the professionalism as if we were in person together. So we do have a really exciting, another exciting talk scheduled for next month, which is July. So I'll drop the link to that here as well. So in July, JD Ryan is going to be coming and talking about reproducible reporting with Quarto, which is exciting topic. And I know the one like when I was more focused on data science practice as my job, it was just something that really, really scaled up my ability to be productive. So that's really exciting. We are going to skip a meeting in August. And if you're looking for something to do in August that is related to R and data science and all those kinds of things, Posit Conf is happening in August. And just actually in the last day or so, the virtual registration opened up. So I just dropped the link to that here. So you can it is now open and ready for you to register. So the keynotes and the regular sessions are going to be streamed, and so you can listen and learn a lot about R and Python and data science during those talks. So there is a registration fee for the virtual experience. There is one for regular individuals, one for like nonprofit and government employees, and there is a zero cost option for students or academics, or if you are in a situation where like you cannot afford to pay that cost. So that cost just does go to the streaming and like keeping all that going. So it is the goal with PositConf is always to try to break even and to pay for what it costs to actually put it on. But that's what we're gonna invite you to do in August if you are interested in doing some learning then. All right, we've got a pretty good group, so I think we will go ahead and get started. So I'm really excited to introduce Tom Mock as our speaker here. So Tom Mock is a product manager at Posit, and Tom works on Posit Workbench and the RStudio IDE as a product manager there. And we are really glad to have you, Tom. I know this is a topic that people are super curious about, really want to know more about, want to know about how all this works. What are the like it's really exciting, it's a little bit scary, what's going on. So I really appreciate you, Tom, being willing to prep a talk and share with us about how to use generative AI in the RStudio IDE. So thank you for being here, and we would love to have you get started. So Tom is going to give a talk, and you feel free to type questions that you have in the chat as we go along. And if something is really relevant to what's going on right there, I might draw your attention to it, Tom, as we're going through, and then we will have time for questions at the end as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much for having me, y'all, and good to be here. I'm going to share my screen and get started, and I'll just reemphasize, feel free to ask questions in the chat. If they are pertinent, I'll try and answer them on the fly during the presentation, but there'll be plenty of time at the end to go into semi-off topic or longer form questions as needed. So let me share my desktop. I've got RStudio open. I know it's small for now, but we'll get to that in a second. And then Julia, confirm my screen.
Yep,
You see
you look
okay?
at, I see your slides about Copilot being in RStudio.
Awesome, cool. I have a short link here that I'll paste in the chat, but it's on every single one of the slides as well. But that is the short link. That'll take you to kind of a permalink of the slides. This slide deck has evolved a little bit. I've given kind of some different variations of it, and this is a longer form one. So this one may change and evolve in the future, but excited to talk about it today. GitHub Copilot was actually, and generative AI in general, was a huge feature request for RStudio for a long time. So let me change that login for you. That's a good call out, and I will do that once we get closer to the end. Um, and as people wanted this, they really wanted to have kind of a co-pilot to sit in with them to help them with their coding needs, right? So we're always kind of framing this as like it's now available in terms of like it's been a request, it's available in our studio, and you can use it, and you should have access to these slides now. So I always open with this talk is actually closing a specific issue, which is number 10, 148. It had over 500 upvotes at the time I took the screenshot, although I think it's like 534. Some people came by later and upvoted it. And people really wanted this tool, right? Like they're like, hey, I've used it in other things or I've heard about it. I really want to try out something that can help me potentially code faster or fill out boilerplate or just I want to see what it's all about and I want to do it within our studio. So really excited that we're able to kind of get these integrations in, and it also opens the door for other integrations that people want to do in the future. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. Um, Before I go into all about Copilot though, just as a precursor, I also like to talk a little bit about what is generative AI and what does that mean for code specifically. So generative AI is a lot of different things, but largely I think of it as tools designed to create new content like text or images or code, amongst other things. Generative AI uses a lot of different techniques. Ultimately, it's trying to identify patterns in training data and then generate novel or new outcomes based upon those patterns and the training data that it's been trained on. In most cases, these are large language models that have been trained on millions or billions of different examples of code across many different languages. So not just R, not just SQL, Python, all sorts of different languages for both general software development as well as things like data science. So they're not specific. It's not just code as like a huge one, monolith. It's code as an umbrella of text generation applied to code generation. The way I like to kind of wrap my head around that is you might do something like this with a tool like Midjourney, which is used to create images. You write out some text. In this case, I want a transparent PNG of a seated robotic android Boston Terrier. I've got a dog named Howard, so this is my little co-pilot that's always here working with me at home. And I wanted a little, art of him and kind of this robotic android. So I can think of him as a helper as opposed to someone who just kind of sleeps in my room all the time. So you can see in just a little amount of text, I can get out something quite complex. So this image is worth 1,000 words, but it only took, 20 or 30 to get there in terms of getting an output that I wanted after a few different iterations of like, oh, I don't like that one as much. Let's try and restyle it or change the text. And while this is fun and I like playing around creating images and other art kind of with this, ultimately you probably want to be more productive with it and see if it can actually make you faster at certain development tasks or help you decrease like the difficulty of novel code. Maybe if you're learning R, you don't know everything, or if you're kind of concurrently bouncing between R and SQL or R and Python, you might be stronger in one versus the other. So it's nice to kind of have someone patient, this little co-pilot that can help you out with tasks. So again, images are fun, but ultimately we're trying to go back into a little subset of generative AI for text. So we're not just trying to create images, we're actually trying to create text and not just prose or like comments like you're seeing here on a slide, but rather text that is code. For text generation, generative AI kind of takes this approach of predicting the next word, or you'd call a token or a string. So it has some context from whatever prompt you've asked. The prompt would be like asking a question, right? So if I say, "Hey Julia, what is tidy models all about?" Julia goes into her brain, comes out with something, and gives you back what she thinks tidy models is about. Generative AI does not have general intelligence like we do, but it is able to take some context along with the training data and then spit out what is likely or statistically likely to be the next word in that sentence. So I might go to a tool like ChatGPT or other chat interfaces. And again, asking is also known as like prompting. You're prompting the tool to give you a response. Hey, complete the sentence every good. And it's like, well, what sentence would likely come after every good. And it might look something like this, where the red is what the actual outcome was for one non-deterministic run, but there are variations or like a fork of the tree as it goes down and makes decisions. And you can see the very first word that's generated is actually pretty low probabilities. Thing is really high, so every good thing, but it might be every good story or every good action. There's different ways that this could have gone. And generative AI tools are non-deterministic in that you don't get the same response every single time. So sometimes you kind of loop through it and try and give more context or guide the response in a different direction. And you can go through that really quickly so you can try out a bunch of different forks in your tree if you want to think about it that way. Once you do have that first word, then you can see that all the probabilities actually increase a little bit because it says, hey, this sentence is being built up more and more. Every good thing must come. And at that point, we're like 99% chance that's like, oh, well, the next word is going to be to and end. And so every good thing must come to an end. Like that sentence makes sense together, statistically likely to happen. Or it's present in some form in the training data. So it's like, oh, I can kind of complete this idea. This is an oversimplification, and again, I don't want to go too far on the underlying kind of training of models or how they actually work, but just give you a sense of like these are not generally intelligent. So we're trying to focus on code generation is what we're talking about today with Copilot. But generally, you have to be comfortable with this idea of like you're making a prompt. That prompt is non-deterministic, and it may not be exactly what you want the first time. Like you may go down this little rabbit hole or this fork that is not exactly what you wanted. And we can work with that because the looping is very, very fast, right? You're not waiting 30 minutes or 2 days to get to result with this really large model training, but really thinking of like milliseconds, hundreds of milliseconds, or a second or two to kind of complete one of these loops. And then you can be like, oh, this is really good, and I'll edit, or this gives me a direction to go in and I can actually write some of my own code. So we'll keep going. Ultimately, this also means that we need to kind of trust but verify, right? Like we're generating something where the generative AI doesn't have a brain or general intelligence. It's not as amazing as someone like Julia with all this kind of general knowledge. It's hyper focused on being good at text generation and code generation specifically with a tool like Copilot. It's really just a model that's been trained on a massive, massive amount of data. So things that are outside of that training data mean that it may not be as good as those tasks. So you can imagine if the model was trained in 2023 and you write a brand new package called super cool package in 2024, that is not present in the training data. So it might be able to guide certain directions, but it can't use the training data to say, oh, I know what dplyr is, or I know what data.table is, or tidy models, and I actually have lots of examples. There's no examples in that data set. That being said, it is covering a lot of the most kind of fundamental things, and especially for mature R packages, they've been around for a long time. So this is not always an issue unless you're on like the cutting edge. The output might not always be right, appropriate, or optimal, right? Like it's predicting these little tokens or strings one after each other, which one's statistically likely. That doesn't mean it's capturing exactly what your intent is, right? It's working off the context that's in the training data and the context you provided in your source code or in your document. And it can make up things that aren't true or use code that doesn't actually exist or run. Some people call these hallucinations, right? Like making up something that sounds likely but isn't valid. And I'm not saying that this happens all the time, but you'll get situations where you're like, oh, I know this is like 90% right and I'll have to edit it. Or there's certain times where it's really, really good. And you're like, hey, I could actually use this off the shelf. Like it's boilerplate that it filled out. This all works and it works nicely. But you really should insert yourself in this loop of you're the general intelligence that knows what is the business problem you're trying to solve, what is the model kind of that you want to use, what is the actual task you're trying to complete. You have more of that intent in yourself than the model will, although there are some strategies I'll talk about for actually getting your intent over to the model a bit better. So ultimately, just important to verify the output before using it because you can't just blindly trust these outputs, whether it's text or images or code. So the last part is that this is very quick to experiment, right? It should be on the order of hundreds of milliseconds or seconds, as opposed to I just wasted 3 hours creating something and now it's worthless. That's not kind of the situation. It's usually kind of interjecting yourself, getting some help, going back to working on itself, and actually prompting our own knowledge to say, okay, this got me a direction, and now I can continue working and solving the problem. I just needed a little nudge myself to be productive. As far as we've talked about generative AI, we've talked about generative AI for this idea of like text generation or code generation, but what is Copilot itself? So Copilot is an AI pair programmer that offers autocomplete style suggestions and real-time hints. These suggestions come up as what is called ghost text based on the context of the surrounding code. So you hear autocomplete style suggestions, and then we bring up this novel idea of ghost text. Like, let's first talk about autocomplete. Autocomplete parses the code in the environment, right? This is in basically any modern integrated development environment, including RStudio. It says, hey, you type 3 letters, and those letters were REA. We will autocomplete all the read underscore functions from reader, so you can read in a CSV or read in Parquet or read in whatever, right? It's just auto-completing from a static list of possible completions. So it's not going to give you write CSV, right? Because it has to fill out the remainder of that string. So anything that starts with REA is filtered down and printed into the environment as like a tab complete. So importantly, that's possible completions, and it's a static set of completions that are available from packages you've installed, from code in your environment, function names, data names. All the things have to actually exist in your environment or be provided from your IDE or source packages that are like running around in your computer. When we say autocomplete style suggestions with Copilot or with generative AI in general, Copilot and other tools like that also parse the code, right? They read through the code that's sent along as a prompt to the generative AI endpoint, along with some environment variables and the billions of examples of other training data code. And then it will supply likely completions. This doesn't have to be a situation where it has to start with these exact letters, but really what is the context within the file and what is the most likely completion that the tool will give you. This will then be presented as like a dynamic set of completions, right? It's not limited or static to what's available on the computer, but really anything that could fit there, and you're actually leaving your computer to get those results. You're saying, send this context, hit an API endpoint, give me back a result. There are local models like Llama and other tools, but in this example, we're actually sending things across the wire to an endpoint and then getting a response back from that endpoint. So this is really exciting because you're not limited to what's just inside your environment, but what is really possible within the entire context of code that it's been trained on. So I'll give you a quick example here with some pictures. Autocomplete, again, I start typing MEA and it says, oh, you probably want the arithmetic mean. And there's a bunch of different variations of this for different data types. What's not taken into consideration here for autocomplete is actually have a comment. This comment is meaningless, right, to autocomplete. It should be ignored. It's a comment. It starts with a pound sign. So it says take the mean of the MPG column in mtcars dataset. While autocomplete in an IDE will ignore that, Copilot will say, hey, you started typing M, but also this context you sent along the wire says you want to take the mean of the MPG column in the mtcars dataset. So therefore, why don't we just do that? Why don't we jump ahead to what we think your intent is and do that? Of course, this is a trivial example, but open your mind here in the sense of like, there's more context than just the 3 letters or the 5 letters that you've been typing. Even if it still looks like autocompletion, it's really autocompletion plus, like this idea of ghost text and synthetic generation as opposed to from that static list. So now RStudio has this concept of ghost text. We've got another comment here to calculate the average fuel efficiency of cars grouped by the cylinder variable. We have a library dplyr. And then I go down on a line 5. I don't even type anything, and it just auto completes, hey, you probably want to group by cylinder, summarize, and get that out. So Copilot takes the existing things you've written, the context, generates possible solution as ghost text, and then you can choose to accept it or decline it. That ghost text doesn't exist. It's not inserted without you accepting it. It's could be multiple lines or a single line, and then you can either tab complete or enter complete or whatever your shortcut is to actually accept the completion or start over, right? You can backspace out or escape and say, well, it told me to do something that's not what I'm trying to do. I'll just keep coding, or I'll add more context and prompt it again to get a different result. Non-deterministic, right? Fast loop, almost immediate reaction. And I'll show you a GIF of this on the next slide of how fast it can be. And I'll just stop talking for a second. We'll watch it and then we'll talk. So essentially in real time, I've got some context in this document, and then I get to line 9 and I actually start, I pause for like literally 300 milliseconds. That's the cutoff for, in my IDE, have it set at 300 milliseconds to start generating autocompletions. So I've got a very specific prompt that's close to where my cursor is, that's preferred here. So line 7, return a function to calculate the mode of a vector. But then it also sees, oh, well, there's probabilities in a vector here. So we can actually use those if we wanted to. So it's calculating the mode and it throws out like, hey, here's a function to generate the mode. I can tab complete it in essentially what feels like real autocomplete that fast, almost instantaneous. And then I can actually immediately use it if the function works, right? Like I just accepted it to kind of show the quick GIF, but I typically want to be like, do I understand what this is doing? Is this actually solving the problem I want to? And in this case, it is. Mode is a pretty generic thing. It just happens to not exist in base R. So to get started with Copilot in RStudio, you've kind of seen some of these examples. Number one, Copilot's an external service, right? So we at Posit, we're not providing API endpoints. We're just kind of plumbing your context, sending it to the API endpoint for subscription you already have. So personal or business, whatever you buy through GitHub Copilot. Although there are some examples of free ones for like very popular repos or academic use. There's some kind of edge cases there where you can get Copilot for free. Then you can go into RStudio, Tools, Global Options. There's a new Copilot tab, and you can enable GitHub Copilot, sign in, and then go through the flow. Importantly, until you opt in to actually enabling Copilot, there's actually not things that are installed on your computer. So you don't have to worry about, well, now RStudio is like sending things out across the internet. No, no, no. You have to opt into this. You then have to sign in, download something, and then make that connection. And then you can optionally turn it on and off for specific projects, or at any moment you could turn it off or remove it. So it's really kind of up to you to start using a tool like this. It'll then take you through the OAuth flow for GitHub, and then you'll be signed in as yourself. And you can say, hey, I want to sign out or look at the diagnostics or do some other kind of customization of how to use Copilot inside RStudio. Now, as soon as you do this and you're like, oh, well, I'm trying it out, I want to use RStudio and Copilot together. What do I do, right? You're left with the same problem that many people face when they're starting a new coding project that's open-ended is I just have a blinking cursor. I have no context to get started, right? Like, what do I do? Like, how do I play around with this? So just play around with it. And that's what I like to do with brand new tools is number one, don't be afraid to play around and play around. You probably don't want to use it for like something extremely important off the gate. If it's gonna something you're trying to learn, just try it out with some work that you're working on. I chose to play around with a game, so an actual game called Keyword. I think it existed prior, but my family and I play it through the Washington Post. At a basic level, Keyword is kind of like Wordle, I guess, in terms of like you're trying to guess a word, but you have this context. You're essentially treating yourself as like an autocomplete tool of like, hey, all of these vertical words are missing one letter, and all the letters across horizontally spell a word. It's like a real English word. So you can try and guess, and however the fewest amount of guesses, with one being the minimum, that's your score. So a score of 6 is perfect in this example, and you would have gotten it in one shot across the board. So how can we solve the keyword game and guess something like felony for these different letters and do it perfectly? You can see I messed up on that example that day, and I had to guess 4 different times for the letter sway to actually get that Y. I didn't quite know what I was doing. So how can we solve this with a tool like R, RStudio, and Copilot together? I can use them all together, right? I can use RStudio and Copilot and try and be like, okay, how do I create a function that can solve this for me? It's really open-ended. I don't know what I'm doing, but we're having fun. So this is kind of getting the most out of the generative loop is I have to start from a blank canvas and actually build up commentary, build up context to both solve it for myself and actually get to a functioning example and actually have Copilot or other generative AI tools be helpful. So again, Copilot is a Gen AI tool. It will predict output text and create code. It doesn't really understand anything. It's just a prediction engine, right? Like, so you can't just say, hey, go solve this problem for me, and then just sit there for 2 hours and come back and it's done. It's really like a co-pilot or a buddy riding with you in the car, right? Like a pair programmer. So you have to do some work, it does some thinking, you do some thinking, and hopefully y'all are more productive together. So getting the most out of the generative loop means, number one, what context have you provided? What are the prompts, code, commentary that you've added in your script or your source file? And then those can be included in the prompt that gets sent over to the model itself. Then there's your intent, right? Your intent may not be captured well, and you have to either write your intent into context or you're the one doing the solving. And that's fine. Like for many, many years, we always just worked with our own intent. Be like, I know what I'm trying to do. I'm going to try and solve this problem. But you can't always one-to-one match what your intent is with your context unless you actually provide that context in either comments, code, or other examples. And this ends up with the output of what is actually returned. So based upon the context, which is hopefully capturing your intent, you get output that is useful. So in this example, better context means closer to the intent of the problem you're actually trying to solve, usually leads to a better output, as opposed to, again, a blank canvas where it could go anywhere. You're trying to limit that forking tree problem of like, what is the actual problem I'm trying to hit? So if we want to get into more kind of buzzwords or abbreviations, S2C is kind of my way of remembering this. Simple, specific, and use comments, right? How do I capture my intent into context? Simple, specific, and use comments.
Tom, I
So
have a
simple and
quick
specific.
question
Oh, go
that's
ahead. Yeah.
timely, that's from myself. The context around the AI generative, does it or does RStudio transfer information about the data? Variable names, variable things like that. I mean, I assume that it wouldn't transfer for data, but working in environments where we have
Yep.
PHI and stuff like that, that's a big issue.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll address the second part, which is PII later on. But as far as what RStudio sends across, source code that's in the current, .r, .py, .sql file, .qmd, .r markdown, that file is going to be parsed and then sent across. Environment variables in terms of like empty cars is saved as an object in memory. Some of those things might be sent. Actual data on disk is not sent, right? Like so a .csv, a .rds, those type of things, no. And there's a control inside of RStudio where you can actually turn on or turn off indexing of additional files beyond the source file. So again, like maybe you have 3.r files in your project and you want to get the context from all of them, you can do that, or you can turn that off and say, just focus on the file I have open. And I'll save the second part for later on. So as far as simple and specific, we want to break down these complex tasks. So I typically say like, oh, for myself as well as others, write a high level description of the project goal at the top level, like a top level comment, and then build off of that with more specific tasks. So for example, I know how to play keyword and my family does, but R doesn't out of the box have a solve keyword function, right? I know others have solved similar games like Wordle with R, so I'll start there. I'll be like, hey, at the top level, here's a long set of comments around what I'm actually trying to do. So if I come back to it later, or if my generative AI tool wants to parse through this context, they can. And ultimately, we're trying to guess six letters horizontally across, and those solve words vertically. So I'm not going to read out the whole set, but just like I'm writing down my intent for myself, for others, for Copilot in this example. And this gets us started. We no longer had a blank canvas, but we're actually going towards a solution. Now I can also stay within my simple idea and do the simplest, and that is to cheat, or in this case, be clever. So this is a web-based game. It has JSON on the back end. I can just go to the website, download the data, and print out the answer for any day. It's there on the site. So why don't I just do that? Well, one, that's cheating, and two, that isn't really helpful. Like if I get it every day in 0.1 seconds and I'm not improving over time, that's not very much fun. I want it to like limit the amount of answers or kind of solve it in a more complex way. This is not a fun story. But what else is in that data set that I want to work with? So that JSON actually has today's words with the blanks. So that is something I actually throw into R and start working with, and then have Copilot myself go through and solve for it. So underscores indicate a missing letter in all these words. So that is a simple start from where I can begin and actually create a function to solve these individual words that combine into one word across. So in this example, it was staple is the word, and that would be like STAPLE for all the different words across. So we have like a little bit of context of like, oh, this is how we might be able to solve this type of problem. So staying with the simple idea, let's just get the hint words. So again, I'll break it down to component parts, but let's work with just the hint words. So I write out, again, a long comment because I'm starting from scratch. I'm like, hey, this is kind of what I'm trying to do. I want to get the function that scrapes the website, and then I give it like a function date, or sorry, an argument that is the date, and it will go through and return these letters for me. And then as soon as I start typing JSON underscore URL, Copilot actually completes the rest of this. And here you can see like I actually typed out more commentary than the function name, or sorry, the function itself. So am I saving that much vertical space? Probably not. But would I have used all these different things? I didn't even tell it to use stringer, but it did. And then it like pasted in glue to say like, here's a way you could just inject it in there. It's like, oh, this is a pretty, nicely tied together way of solving this problem. And I can move forward from there. It's like, again, my context is growing. I went from comments at the beginning to actual functions that we'll start using. So we're staying with the hint words, staying simple. And now I can call JSON URL, get the words out, and I can actually work with those rather than having to manually go out and scrape it. I can just say JSON URL, this date, and then give me the results back, as opposed to having to remember, well, what is the actual URL, and go and get it. So that little component part is solved. Importantly, again, I'm not trying to solve it all in one shot. I'm building up all the different parts. Now we've moved past simple. We've got one simple problem we solve, but now we want to get a bit more specific. So we can use expressive names and continue to use comments. So expressive names for variables, functions, objects. Naming things like this is generally a good practice of like, you don't want X1, X5, X11, Z3 as your top level objects that you're working with all the time. Although I'm sure like within a function, those might be valid. They're not very expressive as to what is the purpose of this function or this variable or this object. So I might start typing something like regex from Word. And this is actually saying like, hey, take those incomplete words, so underscore ACK, and actually give me the regex to solve for that missing letter. So just like, hey, in any given word, find the underscore and replace it with a letter, or ignore that and replace the underscore with a blank or whatever. So just trying to find these specific things because it might be in position 1 or position 5. Like it's not always in the same place across any word. So we do have to figure out where we're solving this word for. And then I can actually start using these. And while I've been using a lot of comments before, now I've defined regex from Word and I start typing out matched words, it actually applies the other functions I've written. So it starts using string subset It says, hey, limit words, then use regex from word. It's combining the component parts based upon the name of those into an output, which is matched words. So as you build up more and more context, more of my intent is captured, and it's generally doing a better job. Copilot's not going to install anything. Again, it's just all it's putting out here is ghost text. So if it does suggest a package that you don't have, you'd have to install it. It does generally pick up on library calls. So if I've like loaded library tidyverse at the top, then
There's
it'll,
actually a question specifically about this. Like,
yep,
do you notice that it, so you just said it does not install things. Does it tend to avoid things that are not installed, or does it does it tend to use what you have installed, or is it just responding to like what's in the document
totally.
already, like
Yeah, yeah.
library tidyverse? There was a question
Yep.
about that.
Yep. So it will generally adhere to what is loaded in the environment. So again, I have like library tidyverse in my script. Then yeah, it'll use a lot of tidyverse functions. If I don't have those, I'll actually get a lot more like grep or grepl or base R, $, kind of things like that, because it is picking up on like what's available in here, what else are you using? So even if I've used stringer before, it'll continue using stringer, but it might throw in like a grep in there because like, oh, this, this is the most likely next word. So again, non-deterministic, but does generally do a good job of like, hey, I'm using these functions in there. There are times where even if you haven't loaded tidyverse, it will suggest tidyverse functions because they're in a lot of code out there, right? Like they're very popular. And similarly, like if you have data.table or something else, and I see some of the comments in the chat, it's like it will suggest novel packages that you haven't loaded. But generally, if you want to go in a specific direction, just load the package and then you're in good shape for using that package or that framework moving forward. So again, we've done a lot of commentary. Continuing on this specific idea using expressive names, I've got a very short set of comments, really like one sentence, but I've broken up into two parts. And then I start typing top words and it actually goes through. And you can see here, even though I've used tidyverse, it actually does like an lapply, sapply, set name, some base functions. So again, it's not always going to give you exactly what you want, or maybe this is the best way to approach it and I don't need per or something like that. But if I didn't want to use lapply, I could change it out myself or reprompt it, for example. But you can see this is a pretty rich output based upon a pretty minimal comment of like, this actually is solving and finding the top words, scoring these letters with a score function that we wrote together, and saying like, these are the most likely words, and then matching this across. So trying the top 50 and then arranging them by which one is the most popular or the most likely word to be there. And then without any comments, I might do something like letters from blank, and it's actually going through and pasting all those letters into the words to form them. And we're kind of losing steam on our example of like, I don't want to walk through all of how to solve keyword, but like you can see the amount of comments that I'm having to use are decreasing as the context in the overall document is increasing. This all ends up with something like guess keyword, right? So guess keyword for this date gives me, hey, the keyword is one of the following: recipe or repipe. I don't know if repipe is actually a word, but we'll pretend it is. I like pipes generally, but recipe is a great tidy models package, so we'll go with that one. And that actually is the actual output. It is recipe. So we, again, started from a very open-ended problem, broke it down into simple component parts with a specific purpose, used comments, and as we built up the context of this overall document over time, it got really good at helping me and me interjecting myself. I have the full transcript of like me prompting, saving a response, going through on a gist. And then there's a guess keyword function if you want to try this out yourself or show your family how you can solve keyword every day in like 2 seconds. So there was some questions about what it does or does not do well. And, of course, with these non-deterministic tools, you might get stuck in some examples. So again, try to add a bit more context, go away from that just blinking blank canvas and try and solve a simpler problem, a more specific problem, or even write down some comments both for yourself and for the tool. And maybe just prompt again, because maybe you go down a different fork in your tree, or you kind of write a little bit of your own code and solve it in a different way. Those comments can be either top line, or sorry, top level, meaning like at position 1 in your script, or they can be in line within a function or within other things you're writing. All of that context gets captured, and build off your own momentum, right? Like I didn't stop writing code using a tool like Copilot. I actually wrote a lot more code and then trimmed it down into like, this is the actual problem I solved. And sometimes I turn off Copilot for a bit or use manual prompting where it's like I have to initiate the prompt because it's like, hey, I want to do some more thinking and you're being a bit noisy. You're a backseat driver right now, not a Copilot. Just be quiet or shut up for a second so I can, do some of my own coding. And that's totally valid. There's times where it's noisy and I just want to get some work done or think, or I'm doing something else. And then other times like, oh, I really want it because I have an open-ended problem that I'm trying to solve for. And again, remember, you're trying to add all this better context so you can get closer to your intent to get a better output. And it's not always going to be perfect output, but better output. And so hopefully it is valuable for you, but no one's saying you have to use these tools. And if you're very happy, you don't have to use it, and that's fine. This all being said, there is more than one way to generate text. Right? I've only talked about ghost text or inline code generation. So write a function to get the circumference of a circle and some other context and said, hey, here's how to combine pi, radius, and 2, and it'll give you the circumference of a circle. And in some examples, you might ask it like, hey, you like, I want to actually ask a question or chat with something. So there is an R package called chattr that allows for a chat interface inside of RStudio, whether to on-premise models or on disk like Llama, OpenAI, the API endpoints, or now to Copilot in the last version of chattr that was published. And this actually allows you to ask questions, be like, hey, what's a good package to use for doing X, Y, or Z? Or how could I solve this problem? Or what does this error mean? Or how can I translate this base R code to data table or to dplyr or vice versa? Like all these different types of open-ended, I have a specific question, I want a specific answer. It might have some code, but I also want some text generation that's not code, it's commentary. So generally, like these comments are useful within the ghost text generation. Comments are not really, you're actually writing out questions as opposed to using comments in a chat interface, but there's still like you're writing text that is useful. Again, chattr is a separate package. It's on CRAN now. You can install it and then choose the backend you want to use. And then you can actually run it as a background job and it will show up in the viewer pane of RStudio, or you could pop it out and use it there. And then you can ask questions and kind of have that interactive flow of maybe doing some code completion in line, some questions, and then general coding. And you can kind of opt in or opt out as you see fit. Chattr specifically allows you to control more of the request, right? Copilot's kind of baked in, you don't get to customize the prompt. Versus chattr, you do have the ability to kind of like append a bunch of stuff to any text you write. So Edgar, who's the author of this package, has said, hey, for the prompt, you are a helpful coding assistant. And here's some content to always include, like use tidy modeling with R, or the R for data science book, or the tidyverse package. You're basically encoding explicit intent for everything moving forward as kind of like a style guide of how you want to write code. And you can customize this. You can say, oh, I don't want to use any tidyverse and I'm trying to do a zero dependency package. Only use base R, or only use data table, or only use polars, for example. Or maybe you wanted to write SQL code or Python code. Like you can add all those type of content into here to apply to all of your subsequent chats. Or if it's kind of a one-off, you could just in the actual question, type out some of your intent, be like, hey, I know I'm using tidyverse elsewhere, but for this example, using only base R, solve this problem or whatever.
There's a bit of a question that is
Mm-hmm.
related to do. So someone asked, like, is there a way to give Copilot? So you've said, oh, with chattr, we can have some
Mm-hmm.
of these structure kind of requests. The specific question was like, hey, can I tell Copilot, I like to use this style guide, or I like to like always include comments that are like this.
Yep.
Is there any way at all to prompt Copilot in different ways, or is that something that you would want to have that is possible with an enriched request here versus the RStudio integration with Copilot?
Right. Yeah, so Copilot is not as customizable. They're trying to be kind of like a turnkey solution of like, hey, we think we've got the best prompt for general purpose. You're going to use it, and that's their prerogative, right? Like it's a all-in-one tool. Chatter takes a more generic approach where you can do customization. And again, it doesn't have to use Copilot. It could use an on-disk model like Llama that's free. You don't have to call it to the internet. You run it within your firewall or on your machine, and you could really customize it to do whatever you want. Um, if you are using Copilot for completion inside the source document, generally some of the structure is repeated, right? So if you have specific commenting styles, it may pick up on that and apply them. But there's no like, hey, here's a style sheet, you do it this way, or do it exactly like this for all comments. Some of that might get lost or it might stray off that path. But a good question. And again, so here with chatter, there's like your question, but then it's enriching it with examples of like, hey, there are data files that exist. The files are not being sent across, but the path to them is being sent, the name of data frames, or additional prompts that you've done in your enrichment. And for ChatGPT, it also includes chat history for that session. And then that's sent out to the model and you get a response back streamed into the viewer pane of RStudio. And then you can either, copy it out or just read it and then do whatever you want with the output. Yeah, so again, summarizing here a little bit, generative AI tools with Posit Workbench in RStudio, and I'll get into more questions. Try and follow that S2C, so simple, specific, and use comments. GitHub Copilot is an optional integration, right? So you don't have to use it, and until you actually opt into using it and download a separate user agent, it's actually not even functional. Like it can't even call out to the Copilot endpoint. It's available in 2023.09 and later. And then we did do some improvements in the last release, which was 2024.04 back at the end of April. If you have any feedback, you can feel free to log an issue on our repository for RStudio. And Chatter itself is, again, a separate R package, but you can install it via the cutting edge version off of GitHub or install it from Crayon, but it's chattr or chatter, however you want to think about it. Here's some more mid-journey prompts that I was playing around with. If you're a cat person, I'm a dog person, or maybe you like Totoro, whatever. Like there's a little Copilot out there for you, whoever you are, and whatever animals or creatures you like. But yeah, I'll take open-ended questions. I think there was one that I deferred, which is PII. It's up to y'all, right? Like again, RStudio and Posit Workbench, they are just providing access to these tools, right? You as an individual or you as a company are choosing which model you want to turn on and for what users you want to turn it on. And specifically with something like Copilot, you're actually buying a subscription for an open-ended endpoint that you can work with. I would suggest, like, if you have these type of questions, working with your security team or even the reps over at GitHub and talking to them about how can we use this safely with PII data. Some of the customers I've worked with have separate environments for working with, say, clinical data that is like lock and key. It's behind a firewall. It's offline. There's no internet access. And there's a more general data science platform for doing, analysis about the business where you're like, oh yeah, this is totally fine. We're within our bounds of there's no PII data, even though we work at this pharmacological company. This is the business we're talking about as opposed to patient data that's under a much, much more strict regulated control. So that's my general question or response. I'm not trying to like pass the buck, but it is up to y'all, right? Like Posit Workbench is an on-premise or self-hosted tool, and RStudio is like you install on your desktop. It's really up to y'all how you do or do not want to use it. We want to give you that flexibility as opposed to forcing something upon you, if that makes sense.
Nice, nice. That's really good. So I'm gonna
Yep.
scroll back up to a couple other questions that I don't think we addressed. So tell me if we did. I guess so you showed a lot of like, I write a comment and then code gets generated. Can you speak a little bit to kind of going the other way around? Like I have written code and then can I get comments? If I'm someone
Yeah.
that just hates writing, hates writing comments, I'm like, I never do it. Can I just
Yeah.
make Copilot do this for me?
Some of it, yeah. So I would say the chat interfaces are generally a lot better at, say, explain this, which is like I have an error or I have a function someone else wrote. I'm like, I know how to write R, but this is gobbledygook to me. Like, I don't do object-oriented programming in R or something. Like, what does this actually mean? Chat interfaces are really good at that. For inserting comments within an existing script, it can do some of that. Ironically, you'd probably do something like, "Hey, at the top level, let's do a lot of comments and kind of tech debt on commentary about what this function does." And then as you move forward, you're prompting above a function call or an object name or a definition and trying to get it to say fill out a whole comment. I don't generally use it that way myself, but Copilot also does write sometimes comments on its own without prompting of like, hey, when you're writing a function and you have other functions with rich commenting, it kind of picks up on that and says, oh, well, the context above looks to have a mix of comments and function definitions. Therefore, the most likely output that the user will accept is functions with commentary. Mileage may vary, but that's a valid approach.
Yeah, nice. So you mostly show, I think you only showed using this in .r files, like just
Uh-huh.
scripts.
Yep.
Someone has a question about using this in our Markdown, or
Yep.
I would add Quarto files to that.
Yeah.
How does that work? How well does it work?
Yeah. So
Or does
it'll
it work at
work.
all?
It will work in source files. So RStudio specifically limits you to things like .r, .py, .sql, .rmd, .qmd. So source files. It explicitly excludes things like environment files, so like your .r profile or your .r environ. Those are excluded, and you can't prompt on them. Like they're not being sent, and you can't generate text inside of them. The one caveat I'll say to our Markdown and Quarto is it doesn't work in visual editor mode. It works in source mode. We're looking into whether we want to support it in visual mode. I get that it's interesting, and I think it would be interesting as well, but it's a completely different text generation protocol at a technical level. So while the response could be valid, we need a different way of displaying it. So yes to our Markdown and Quarto in source mode.
Yeah, I have Copilot turned on in the RStudio
Mhm.
IDE, and I like write blog posts in Quarto, and it is interesting. I feel like it will suggest whole chunks, and also
Oh yeah.
it will suggest the text. And
Mhm.
I feel like it's an interesting experience because about like some proportion of the time, certainly not zero, I'm like, oh, that is actually close to what I was going to write, like, and I don't know if in my particular case, it's because
Yeah.
my website, like my own blog
Right.
is in the training data, and like some non-zero proportion of like our blogging content is actually I mean,
Right.
I'm not saying, but like some of it is mine, and like if
Yeah, yeah.
that's why, but I'm always like, oh, that's actually pretty much exactly what I was going to type.
And I think that's the important part is like it will actually give you remarkably good examples in some situations. And I think it's important for you to have some of the background knowledge to say, this is me and I agree with this. Like this is close enough. I might do some copy editing, but this idea of like just letting it generate, 5 pages of text, you're going to go way off the rails and it kind of gets in this weird loop. But it is remarkably good at like, hey, here's a paragraph. And then I'm like, oh, I wish I could summarize. I start being like, I'm going to summarize. And it's like, here's 5 bullet points. And I'm like, those are pretty good. Like, those are a summary of the paragraph I just wrote. Like, those type of like, take this content and refactor it. Really, really nice. And take like complete 1 or 2 sentences or complete this thought. Really, really nice for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. There's one question that I think we've addressed somewhat, but I don't know if you maybe want to expound on
Yep.
it a little bit. And that is about comments, and that is about comments. So
Hmm.
specifically, so I think you've kind of spoken a little bit to um writing clear comments, being,
Yep.
you had you said like concise, clear, or no, simple, concise comments. Oh no, did I just get
Simple,
it wrong?
specific
Simple,
comments. All
specific
good. Yeah,
comments.
you're right. You're
Yes,
right.
simple, specific, and comments.
Yeah,
So the question was a little bit about like amount of comments. So should you just
right.
like double down and like I'm just gonna comment, 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 and that's gonna make this all better? What do you think about that?
It depends. Like if you go in here and the examples I use, and I'm always trying to caution on this, so thank you for the ask. You don't necessarily want to use a tool like Copilot like a chat interface where you're only doing write a comment, get a response, write a comment, get a response, write a comment, get a response. You generally want to write a good amount of like your own code or start the problem and then interject comments where necessary, as opposed to I don't want to turn into I write English language and somebody else writes all my code. That's not the problem I'm trying to solve for. I'm trying to speed up my process. So like, sure, for these toy examples, and because it's non-deterministic, I have to use toy examples because otherwise I'm like trying to solve very complex problems that don't do well in a webinar. But this type of thing of like, do this, then I can get back a response that I know is generally going to be pretty good, as opposed to like a real software development with like my R package GT extras. I would actually go through that a bit slower and kind of write some of my own code, write some commentary, and get outputs. So you can write comments, and I think they're very, very useful, especially if you're starting from this. This is nothing. This is a blank slate. But if you can add some comments about like, hey, here's what I'm doing today. I'm using GT in the tidyverse, and I'm going to analyze empty cars for a group by summarize, and I can actually get like this pretty complex output, and that will display, or it's not completed. It ran out of room, but like that was 36 lines of code that it generated while I wasn't paying attention, right? So let's try and generate that. And it says, hey, here's some examples of like, oh, these things had unused arguments because they don't exist, right? If I try and generate 36 lines of code off of one comment, it's probably not going to do an awesome job versus breaking it down into smaller, simpler, specific component parts, or writing some of my own code. So it's being like, oh, I'm going to use GT, but like, why did we have to format all these numbers this way? I didn't ask you to do that, or that's not my intent. I didn't capture it very well. And that's where comments can be like, hey, you're really going off the rails, off this real rabbit hole. Please stop doing that. And I might even want to turn off Copilot for some situations until I've written up enough context where I'm like stuck, right? Like I know how to write GT code. I love GT, but there are examples of like, how do I take HTML and convolute it in this way to make it work inside of GT? I'm like, I need a little help. How could I do this?
Yeah,
Very
nice.
long-winded answer, but
Yeah, no, that's
yeah,
really helpful. Thank
yeah.
you.
I
So
have
I
a
think,
question on that
yeah,
theme.
yeah, Andrew, go for it.
Of like refactoring code and things. VS Studio is, or VS
Uh-huh.
Code is major competitor to RStudio
Uh-huh.
now. And it has a lot more built-in support for um Copilot.
Yeah.
Does if you were going to take code like this and be like, okay, I want that's good, it's close, but it's not quite there, and you wanted to be able to tell it to change it,
Mhm.
how would you do that? Would you do that through chattr, or could you go through chattr and say like, okay, refactor this code? If I wanted to, if I had something, it's easy to program in dplyr, but I don't
Right.
want the dependencies. Plan program it in dplyr and then say, okay, translate this back to base R.
Right, right, right.
How would you go about that task?
So let's say I have this code, one, you can always, again, have a comment here of like convert the above to use, what is that? Cable extra. And then see like what it does with that of like, oh, okay, we can use a different package to solve this problem. It is very comment driven for these type of, I think VS Code has some like refactor this line or do things like that. With RStudio, you generally would be like inside of a call, you can either write a comment or write it down. The part I like about that is I know where I've used some of this. I can kind of go back and be like, hey, who wrote this code and why is it a little different from what I typically write? I'd be like, oh, I actually had somebody else or had a tool convert this for me, as opposed to losing some of that context. So I get it, like in terms of it's very valuable. VS Code is a really good text editor, and there's some certain things it can do. I do rely on comments a lot to change things, or you could, of course, go into chattr and actually like take an entire script and say, hey, convert this or simplify it. There's other examples of like, I don't know anything about Sass, but in a previous example, someone's like, hey, how can I convert this Sass code to dplyr? And I was like, oh, okay, well, we can try that and see what it does. And it says like, oh, well, you read in the file, and then here is the filter arrange select. And it's like, this dplyr code makes sense to me. I don't know anything about Sass, so I don't know if it's valid. But you can do those type of tasks very quickly inside RStudio with just kind of the context we have there.
Nice.
Cool. I know we're 2 minutes over, so I want to be careful of time.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I
Let me
did open
say,
up
yeah, go
the
for it.
file, and go ahead, Julia. Yeah.
No, I was just gonna say, thank you for coming for this hour.
Mhm.
And we have like, if you as a participant need to hop off, we're really glad that you're here, and join us again another time. And Tom, I don't know if you are able to just do a final sum up before we wrap up here.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, again, Julia and Andrew, thank you so much for having me. Happy to be here. And yeah, try this out. Let me know if you have any feedback. Again, the slides are at this short link, which I'll paste into the chat, and that should be public now. But I'll check on that again with Julia afterwards. Thank you so much and have a great week.
Yeah, thank you.